Hey guys, Eric Smith here, 5 Reasons Sports contributor, also co-host of Scouting the Fins, and you can find that on the 5 Reasons YouTube channel and also the 3 yards per carry feed. Today wrapped up mandatory OTAs for the Miami Dolphins, and as I mentioned in yesterday's review, the potential of giving the players off. And I don't think they gave the players off, but had a closed practice instead, which the media was not able to see, and that is probably likely a very light walkthrough. And it's been mentioned a few times the team has a long break here. I think it's about 5 weeks. So a big part of getting the players in today for the final day of OTAs was probably more about, a lot of housekeeping items and just reminding the players to stay out of the headlines. So, knowing that we're going to have limited information on what happens today, we only have the notes from Mike McDaniel's press conference to review. The first question was on McDaniel's overall thoughts on minicamp and OTAs, and he said that the point of the offseason program was to take action as a team with what they want to do with this time. He said you can't play any games, but you can, have games within the game, and that, team bonding has occurred, that a standard has been created. And then moving forward, right now, all the systems are in place for the daily application and commitment to those standards. And overall, that he was happy with where they are. I think the big part is, the big takeaway from that is that you're set, like you said, you're setting a standard, right? So, if you just come out here and you go through the motions, that when you come back again, right, and you're back on the field, you're probably going to carry that over. So the idea and the value added here is to come out here and practice with intentionality and set the pace of practice so that when you do come out and you get into training camp, right, you're not figuring that out then. You're setting that standard now as to how you want to practice, how you want to move around the field, how you want to go from drill to drill. And then that should, if you're doing this right, carry over into the, more, labor intensive practices that'll come later. Then there was a question about comparing this year's OTAs to last year's. And Mike said, when a team doesn't meet expectation, then guys that were on the team last year and they're still coming back this year, you find a conviction within those players as to what needs to occur. And he said that this offseason was shaped by those lessons, right? Such as having a different sense of what a team is at this point of the offseason. You reiterated again, the standard of the team has been established, and it's a big deal moving forward, but you have to apply it going forward. And that kind of goes back to the previous point there that, it's a big deal to come out in these OTAs, to practice fast, to pay attention to the details. But if you don't keep doing that and going forward, then, this doesn't matter at all. Next question was on the drill at the end of the day yesterday, which was a slip and slide with Aaron Brewer controlling the hose. McDaniel said that's a bonding experience. It's a, foundational principle of loose ball, fumble recovery at all positions. He kind of said you might not have a really wet day at practice, so it's something that you can say for the last day of, OTAs and have some rookies have some fun while diving in the water and incorporating a little bit of football drills in that. He was asked again about the 3 new offensive linemen, and he said, new is important, but it's also important for the guys that have been here for 1 or 2 years for them to think that they own it, right? You have to continue pursue the craft as if you are a new learner. If you don't buy into making gains on incremental techniques, you'll get passed, right? And I think the idea there is just that, you the guys that have been here for a couple of years, right? So your Austin Jacksons, Aaron Brewer going into his second season in this offense, right? You can't just assume that what you did in the previous years is good enough. You have to continue to work on those finer details, those finer techniques, and continue to improve. So it's not just about the new offensive lineman here getting up to speed with what this team does. It's also about the guys that have been here for 2, 3 years now, coming in and still trying to get better. There was a question about the down year for Waddle in 2024 and asked about, how Waddle has approached this offseason. And McDaniel said that Waddle has shown teammates who he really is. And he said that, one thing you can't minimize for a receiver is having quarterbacks that you did not practice with in training camp. And that goes back to 2024 when you had, Tua with the contract holdout, and then you get to training camp and you haven't worked all offseason because of that, really, right? It sets you back. And he said the best players have to show a commitment to growth in their game. Again, same as the offensive line point. Waddle understands his role as a leader a little more, right? And he's taken more ownership and tonality of practice when he, feels a lull in practice. And the example that Mike McDaniel gave was, he'll go after the defense to create those competitive vibes. And he said the trickle down effect of that is real. And we kind of heard that back in 2023 when Tyreek Hill arrived here, right? A big thing was the pace that he practiced at and the way that forced the team to rise to that level. And I felt like that answer was, a lot of the same there, that, right? If Waddle's going out there and he's calling out the defense, right, then it's going to increase the intensity. And you need guys that, players respect that are willing to do that and bring the practice tempo back up when it falls. There was a follow-up question about the quarterbacks being unavailable until the first days of practice. Asked if that was, could be used as basically an excuse for the down year. McDaniel said that Waddle is going to find ways to excel every year as he knows to be the standard now. He doesn't see it that way, right? Not using it as an excuse, and is a secure player working on his craft. McDaniel talked about those, working on his craft, that the returns will be very favorable, and it's not a matter of if they will, but when. There was another question about the coverages faced last year and how that affected the run and pass game. Was asked, did McDaniel feel like the offense was figured out? And he said that, one thing was very clear was that defenses spent time figuring out how to make the Dolphins perform in all facets of the game. To be two-dimensional regardless of how adept the passing game was, and they showed that Miami will have to earn their way out of it, talking about the two high shells, right? And McDaniel said if you're trying to do that with just passing, it's going to be near impossible. And he said, they've been preaching every day about that run and pass balance. So that just goes back to the, very much a theme of the offseason, that the running game has to get back up to where it was in early 2023 when teams really had to respect it. If they were going to sit back in that too high shell, then the Dolphins were just going to gash them up front. Next question was on the, how important is it for the presence of a pass catching tight end, and asked if it helped the offense. McDaniel kind of stepped around and said that, he wants to have a threat of any sort at all five eligibles. You need to make the defense pay if they're going to overplay on certain players. And, Mike doesn't approach it as a X, Y, or Z, right? You just need to have pass catching threats. And those can be halfbacks, they can be tight ends, can be third wide receivers. And, McDaniel said it helps, but it helps to have that potential threat at tight end, but you need to have productivity at all five eligibles. And it can be a blocking tight end who's just adept at breaking tackles and, getting some of the same production as those more, the higher athletes, the pass threat type tight ends. He was asked about Jalen Wright and, something he said, I think it was on, maybe day one, about Wright's ability to non-verbally communicate. And, McDaniel said, it's basically a manufactured way of McDaniel saying that he sees better than he hears, that McDaniel, right, he can see something on the field better than he hears a player talking about. Said the best way to show that someone wants to ball and that he's, is to be very on point with his track in the run game or the route to show that he wants the ball. And, he kind of expanded on that, saying that he's found a lot of ways to say the same thing, right? Another way of saying that is actions are louder than words, and that's something that we've heard from McDaniel in the past as well. Question came up about Bradley Chubb yesterday, saying the team was lying about the commitment to culture change, and McDaniel kind of, avoided that question. He said it would have been awesome if Chubb told McDaniel that on the front end, meaning last year that they were lying. But he, then said he's much more concerned about 2025. You do a lot more for the organization if you spend more time looking forward rather than talking about whose fault it was. So again, kind of avoided it, but said they're looking forward when talking about that. And there's a question about, when did you learn that teams change from year to year, no matter how much turnover there is, whether it's 90% of the roster that's coming back or 50%? And McDaniel referenced the 2012 to 2013 season, said that was his first year with Washington, had a rookie quarterback, went 10-6, went to the playoffs, came back the following year, only won 4 games. And then he said that Pete Carroll told him that people are never the same, right? And, Mike took that and could make sense of it. He agreed that from a tape standpoint, players are either getting better or worse. You're not staying the same, but that in general, that also carries over to, everyone is going through something different in life. And there's a lot of mistakes of expecting people to stay the same. So Mike has learned to pay attention and adjust based on the needs of the player. And then, another phrase that he's used multiple times, right? The team is built on individuals to create a collective. And then, said that it takes a lot of trust to build a team. And that goes from the head coach down to the assistant coaches, down to the players. And, basically saying that those relationships are different on every team. Then Mike was asked about how he's evolved based on what he's learned from himself and the team. And, he said that he's always based coaching and who he is as a person on the idea of trying to achieve more and level up, right? Evolution is very imperative in his life, he said he wants to pay attention to what's happening, learn from it, be open-minded. Growth is good. And, he said that he is resistant to non-evolution. You're supposed to take life lessons and apply them. He's going to get older and wiser, and it's important to evolve. And he asks it of the players too. He says it's important to lead by example, and then ended it by saying that that's hard to define exactly what that means, but it does kind of go back to that point that we talked earlier about both the offensive lineman and Jalen Waddle in terms of he's looking for these players, even the ones that have been in the system, to continue to evolve, and he actions speak louder than words. He wants players to see that he's doing the same thing. There was a question about Austin Jackson. I really didn't, catch it, but Mike McDaniel said that he is doing well. And there was a question I really liked regarding Aaron Brewer. And, Aaron Brewer saying this is his first time playing the same position on the same team in back-to-back years and they didn't have him, in these mandatory OTAs last year due to an injury. Asked about the importance of continuity. And McDaniel said that center is a lead communicator. The Mike linebacker, your quarterback, your center, they have to have ownership, confidence. The way they deliver that is important. He also said that Brewer has an athletic skill set that's unique for his position. And when his technique is right, he can be a very violent player, right? And there's a correlation between that and the tonality that, and the respect that others have. The more that he's able to be a fixture of leadership on the team, the better they are, right? Again, going back to that idea, as you get more comfortable, right, with the technique, when you get your technique right and you can, be that violent player, then the guys around you are going to follow that. They're going to do the same thing, right? So it's just, Brewer continuing to grow in that role, both on the field as far as his play and his leadership. And there's a question about, whether there are any boundary cornerbacks in camp that are, standing out. McDaniel said he's not going to, declare a player going into 5 weeks being off, right? And he said not to say there's not a leader in the clubhouse. And he said the off season has been tremendous. There's been some great boundary corner work. Went to the defense takes 11 people to be tied together. And, he said that he has seen growth not only because of that group, but the nucleus around them, right? He used the phrase iron sharpens iron. I think that that was important because, it goes back to the idea of, using the the front seven, right? You have the return of Phillips, the return of Chubb. You've got the investment in the defensive tackle positions. You brought back Terrell Dotson. I think they're really banking on that front seven playing well to help cover up some of the issues on the back end. Next, he was asked about Kendall Sherfield, who was I think he came in as a tryout player for one of the previous OTAs and then was signed to a contract. To point out that he's been working with a elevated unit was the phrasing used. Um, and, Mike said, what do you think they're doing? Like, they're not just sitting around. There's constant evaluation going on, right? He said, meeting rooms, drill work. He said, hot runs of production. He said they're using a lot of variation in the secondary. And that, even in a game, there's more of that than somewhere like the offensive line. You constantly have guys rotating in and out. So communication is very imperative there, not just from the first unit, but as you rotate guys in, um, you can't have fall off in that communication. He said that they're pushing and challenging each other in a very competitive atmosphere. And, you know, a point that he talked about before with defensive backs, he said, you know, sometimes they're giving someone burn with a certain group one day and they want to see how he reacts, but they also want to see how the players who didn't get that burn react. Like, are they over there pouting? Are they still engaged in learning? And then flipping it the next day. And then, he even joked that he might get out there for a rep so the offense can get a quick touchdown. That was followed up by a question regarding Cam Smith. And he said that, when speaking about the team this offseason, he's in a great spot, right? But the question now is, how's he going to build on it? After these 8 weeks that they've been working together, they feel very good, right? Um, that Cam Smith has proven to be very on this in this defensive scheme at a couple positions, which I thought was kind of important there. I think we all view Cam as just a boundary corner, but if he's very on it in a couple of positions, it feels like they're maybe working him somewhere else, whether it's a slot or something else. And then he said, moving forward, we'll see what he makes of that. A lot of guys that can identify let's do it instead of let's talk about it. So I think that's, again, a common theme with Cam Smith here is that it's not about what he's done these 8 weeks. It's about what he does these next 5 weeks when he's away. There's been questions about the way he takes care of his body. So is he going to take those steps to do the right things over these next 5 weeks and get his body right so that when they come back, he's ready to go physically and also has done the mental exercises to come back and still be sharp mentally. Next question was on that defensive front seven, and it's showing the ability to control and win games in these OTAs. And again, McDaniel went back to the communication. He said one commonality between all structures is that communication out of the huddle has to be crisp, and they have to have ownership of it. So if you're finding dominance in the front seven, you're having connectivity from the defensive line to the outside linebackers to the stack linebackers. He talks about, playing with gap integrity and use the example. If a nose is keeping an offensive lineman off of the stack linebacker, then the linebacker can't overrun the play because there's no cutback with the nose being able to be in good position. Right. And he talked about, what you can gain in these OTAs is, in terms of technique, hand placement, communication, those are the type of things that you can work on during these non-padded practice. And he finished that question up saying, you know, that, not renting the words, but making them come to life. So you're not just, hearing Coach Weaver and you're, reiterating what he's saying, but you're carrying that over to the field and you are applying it, right? Again, you see better than you hear. And that led to a question of the growth of defense with Anthony Weaver. And this is another interesting point because it kind of goes to a topic that I've talked about before about this being the first time in a decade the Dolphins have returned both the same offensive and defensive coordinator together. And Mike said it's been amazing how this offseason he's been able to spend time with the staff and see how they can utilize each other to create gains towards the ultimate goal of being better than the opponent. I said there's a lot of detail and specific drill work based on off-season studies, so we're not implementing a new scheme again. Now we're, you know, using those off-season studies to figure out what you have to do next. And the example they gave here was, if you say that you have a lot of missed tackles, right? In year 2 of the defensive scheme, you can now, use that film to, create a paintbrush to show them how to put themselves in position to be better tacklers, right? And the nuts and bolts of technique and fundamentals in year 2 is much more manageable than in year 1 when you're just trying to get the basics of the defense in. So that wrapped up his media availability today. Like I said, no practice, so I don't think we're going to have the player availabilities later today either. I hope you guys have found these summaries of the mandatory OTAs productive and helpful, especially if you don't have the time to watch all of the media availabilities and to comb through all of the notes from those media availabilities and the on-field stuff. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll talk again soon.